Hello, welcome back. Thank you very, very much for tuning in. I hope you're doing well, and I hope your wife's businesses are doing well. Now, I'm sure there's a few of you who are probably a little confused by the title of this video, and that's okay, it is kind of a confusing title. What the title of this video means is that if you are a real woman, then you do not do housework. Nah, I'm kidding, that's not what it means. The title of this video is actually the title of a book written by an anonymous female author, very likely an anonymous female psychologist, and we'll get to that in a second, writing under the pseudonym of Lady Misato. Now, I was hoping to do a reading of this book on this channel, but I'm not going to be able to because, to my utter dismay, it's actually copywritten under that pseudonym, which I didn't know you could do. So I'm going to leave a link to this book in the description of this video. It's available online for free, and I highly recommend you guys go check that out. In this video, I'm going to briefly detail and summarize its contents, and I believe that this is a fantastic way to preheat the oven for and to segue into a much more complicated topic that's going to be coming up on this channel a little later. Now, what is this book about? Well, I'm very glad you asked. It is a how-to manual for wives that teaches them how to covertly modify the behavior of their husbands using intimacy-based operant conditioning. Did you catch that? Now, I've already mentioned in previous videos how there is a multi-pronged effort in the United States to dismantle and eradicate certain norms, values, behaviors, beliefs, attitudes, and traditions. But what a lot of you may not be aware of is that behavioral modification techniques are very often being employed to achieve these ends. They're being employed at various levels of our society by various groups of people, and these are methods that most people do not readily recognize as behavioral modification techniques. The reason I felt it pertinent to cover this book is because the methods described in this book are very much within the ballpark of other methods that are being utilized more broadly to culturally and socially re-engineer our society. The chief difference is that the methods detailed in this book are meant to be employed within a romantic context on a one-on-one basis, whereas the methods that I'll be describing later on this channel are usually employed on a much more broad level by enormous groups of people in some cases. One final thing I want to mention before we dive into this. In my years of research in feminism, I've actually stumbled upon quite a few books like this that were authored by an anonymous female professional and that detailed highly unethical methods to go about psychologically manipulating a man, traumatizing him, tearing him down, or to otherwise gain the upper hand over him. Not all of these books have dealt specifically with the manipulation of male psychology. Some of these books have dealt with how to gaslight a man or how to Me Too a man. One such book is a book called How to Destroy a Man Now, authored by an anonymous female writer writing under the pseudonym of Dr. Angela Confidential. You can find this book online. And Mrs. Confidential, according to her own admissions, is a business psychologist and consultant and a human resources specialist. And over the past several years, I've noticed this trend of women who are using their educational backgrounds to devise unethical methods to go about harming men, and they tend to relate these methods to other women anonymously, either through a book or through a private female space or another similar avenue. Now, any of you guys out there who have studied feminist theory have certainly noticed the peculiar trend among feminist theorists to be psychologists. Many of them are. And feminist theory itself is rooted in psychology and sociology. Many of the methods these people devise to go about dismantling existing power structures like patriarchy are fundamentally rooted in behavioral psychology and the manipulation of it. This is something we're going to be exploring in great detail on this channel. Well, without further ado, we're going to dive right into it. But a quick word of warning, if you have kids in the room, I wouldn't advise you watch this video around them, please. In the introduction to this book, Mrs. Misato relates an experience she had where she came home from work one evening. She was exhausted and she had been working nonstop for several months. On this particular night, she crawled into bed hoping that her husband was already asleep, but he wasn't, and he instigated a round of bow, shake a wow wow. After they finished, she pushed him away, they went to sleep, and at this point she tells the reader that she had, in truth, lost all attraction to him, owing to the fact that she had steadily advanced in her own career while he had remained stagnant in his. She had become the primary breadwinner. The next morning, when they woke up, her husband confronted her and asked her why she was never in the mood, and she told him, "If you want to get me in the mood, why don't you help out around the house and do some of these house chores?" And what she found was that he was more than happy to throw himself into that situation in order to win her intimacy. This in turn gave her an idea, and she applied her knowledge to devise a strategy to train her husband to give up his headship role within the marriage. At this point, she began to refine her strategy, and in the book, she explains to the reader how she has personally coached dozens of women on how to do this in their own marriage. Quote, "Sometimes with the permission of the husband, but more often without his knowledge or consent." Mrs. Misato explains how there is a conflict of will in every marriage, and one spouse will always have the tendency to defer to the authority of the other spouse. Traditionally, this has entailed wives submitting to the authority of their husbands, but this book is meant to teach women how they can wield their sexuality to train their husbands to defer to their authority in every aspect of the marriage. This is accomplished by using sexuality as a form of operant conditioning. If you don't know what operant conditioning is, it is a form of reward or punishment-based behavioral training. In operant conditioning, you suggest to somebody to engage in a certain behavior, and when they do engage in that behavior, you reward them for engaging in it, and that reward reinforces that behavior. It increases the likelihood that they will repeat that behavior, and the more they repeat that behavior, the more it becomes a habitual behavior. Likewise, if they don't engage in that behavior, you punish them for it. Now, sexuality in this context is being used as the reward to reward men for engaging in behaviors that their wives want them to engage in. And when the men don't engage in certain behaviors, the women simply don't have sex with them. She found that this is an extremely effective strategy to get men to give up their authority in the marriage, because where men are wired to be authoritative and to hold on to that authority at all costs, men are also wired to pursue sex with women at all costs, and they don't recognize these tactics as being subversive to their own ego. They are wired to have sex with women at all costs, and most men are willing to do just about anything to sleep with a woman. So what Mrs. Misato outlines in this book is a rather complex strategy for wives to incorporate these tactics into their own marriage, to begin guiding their marriage while rewarding their husband for going along with their guidance, or cutting them off when they don't go along with their guidance. Mrs. Misato refers to this as erotic power in her book, and she defines erotic power as women's capacity to exert control over their husbands through his sexual desire for them. And she explains that men don't know how to resist this, and that erotic power provides the male ego with an excuse for giving in to women no matter what they demand. Mrs. Misato encourages her readers to figure out subtle ways to incorporate these techniques into their marriage so that their husbands are never fully conscious of the fact that they're being rewarded for desired behaviors. That way the behavioral changes will affect these men on a subconscious level. This in turn opens up a new door of possibilities to these wives who can begin to incorporate new elements into their technique, such as secondary reinforcers. A secondary reinforcer is any neutral stimuli that acquires a charged association through its pairing with a primary reinforcer. In plain English, let's say that we have our primary reinforcer, which is sex. Sex is the reward for the desired behavior. But if you begin pairing sex with something like words of praise, and you do this over and over and over again, every time the husband exhibits the desired behavior, you reward him with words of praise and then sex, he will begin to develop a sexual association to those words of praise. So whereas words of praise in and of themselves have no sexual association, through their pairing with the primary reinforcer, i.e. sex, they develop a charged association. And these men will find that when women utter words of praise, they find themselves becoming aroused, and they find themselves being controlled and guided by these words of praise. She also found that during this stage of the process, certain curious phenomena sometimes begin to develop, such as men developing a sexual association with their gesture of submission to their wives. In other words, men grow aroused just by deferring to the woman's authority, and it happens on a subconscious level. They're not even fully aware that it's happening. Mrs. Misato relates in her book that these wives are fundamentally tapping into a dopamine feedback loop, and they're getting their husbands addicted to the process of submitting to their wives through using sexuality as the reward. And little by little, the men are fundamentally altered, and their position in the marriage is forever changed. But that's my quick summary of the central method outlined in this book. The book itself is a lot more complex and goes into much greater detail. You can find the link to that book, sorry about that, in the description of this video. And I highly urge you guys to go check that out. It will help you better understand much more complex material that's going to be coming up on this channel very shortly. As always, thank you guys very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.